I was deployed with the Royal Marine Commandos during the Gulf War. I'll never forget my only combat mission. Who am I? Well, I could tell you the truth, but then you'd probably never get to hear this story, and I'd be dead within a week. So for now, you can call me Corporal Dexter, and I'll be changing the names of the rest of my squad and anyone else to protect them as well. I joined Her Majesty's Navy in 1987 at the tender age of 18. From the beginning, I knew exactly where I wanted to be. The Royal Marine Commandos, the elite force of the best the Royal Navy had to offer. I passed all the pre-selection tests and interviews without much fuss. The PRMC selection course also went fairly well. Then, onto the 32 weeks of actual training. It had its ups and downs, and I did doubt myself at times. But I managed to finish out somewhere in the middle of my class. From there, I was stationed for about a year in Belfast, keeping the peace, as they say. That year felt like an eternity for me and the boys in my unit. Car bombings, snipers, ambushes. We were almost cheerful when we got back to the barracks one cool evening to find out that there was a dust-up half the world away from Ireland. The British government agreed to join the Yanks in their little crusade against the man with the beret and the stash, and we were about to go play soldier in the big sandbox. We got the call about an hour later to pack all our kit and be ready to catch a flight to Saudi Arabia the next morning. I slept most of the way, but did manage to wake up in time to see the sunrise over the deserts of Arabia. Like most kids, I grew up with tales of this land and the riches, adventures, and terrors it had to offer, and I had a feeling I'd get to experience all three before the end of this excursion for Queen and Country. As the airbase the coalition forces were using came into view over the horizon, some bloke cranked the volume to that old song, Horse with No Name by America. Through the stereo in the Land Rover they stuffed in the cargo plane with us, we all had a small chuckle and complimented the young private for his timing, right as the landing gear touched down, shaking the cabin of the massive C-130, jarring us all back to reality. We collected all our kit and started to file out of the back of the aircraft and into lorries that would take us to our assigned barracks. As I neared the rear door, one of the boys from my unit, we'll call him Harris, spoke up. "So do you fancy yourself part of the next desert rats? Or perhaps Lawrence of Arabia?" I laughed once to myself and then turned to him. "I fancy myself coming home alive, Harris." Harris: "Oh, come on now, where's the sense of adventure?" "It's still there, Harris. I just want to live to tell the stories myself." I laughed and grinned back at him. Harris was a young, conventionally handsome guy with brown hair, average height, the kind of guy you'd see on ads promoting the Royal Navy. We took our seats in the back of the lorries and took off towards the rows of freshly built barracks. The lorry pulled up along the front of one of the barracks and went down the row, stopping at each building as names were called. 2 or 3 men got off at each building. "Just like the school bus back home," Harris muttered to me. "Except these bags weigh less than the ones we carried back then," I replied. Harris laughed in agreement. Soon Harris and I were called, and we hopped out of the back of the lorry in front of the sun-baked and sand-covered barracks. "And here we are," I say to Harris as we head up to the front door. I opened the door to see 4 other men bearing the Royal Marines patch on their shoulders unpacking. "You boys with Arrow Squad?" I asked as they all turned to me and nodded in the affirmative. Arrow Squad was the call sign they gave to us when we were called up to join the operation in the Middle East. Only Harris and I were kept together from our old unit in Belfast. "I guess we should introduce ourselves then," the tall and muscular red-headed man standing to my right said. "I'm Sergeant Royce. I've been assigned to be squad leader." Next, the thinner guy and shorter man with satin black hair in the back spoke up. "I'm Corporal Mills, sharpshooter." He turned away again. Then the markedly younger, blonde lad chimed in. "I'm Private Lang. I'll be handling the comms for the squad. This is also my first deployment." As if we all couldn't tell. "But I'm glad it's with you guys," he added before turning with us to look toward the last of the men in the barracks. A short but stocky gent lifting weights shirtless on his cot. "My name's Lee, support gunner, so I'll be the one covering your asses for the next 6 months." He had a large scar just above his right shoulder blade. He had been in the shit. Then the room all turned to us as I gave the introduction for both Harris and myself. I'm Corporal Dexter. I'll be second in command to the sergeant, as well as acting as grenadier for the squad. And this here is Lance Corporal Harris. He'll be handling all things mechanical for the unit, as well as being the designated comedian. Oh, that'll be real helpful in a gunfight, Lee quipped. Hey now, Lee, we could all use a bit of humor here, Royce added. We got settled in and enjoyed our first and only quiet evening in Arabia till lights out at 10 p.m. Harris thought it would be hilarious to loosen up some screws on Lee's cot while he was at supper. 5 out of the 6 men in the squad did enjoy the prank as Lee went rolling into the floor, crumpled like cardboard under him. The 6th man in the squad, though, was not as amused and immediately identified Harris as the culprit. Lee picked up his entrenching tool and chased Harris clean out of the barracks and forced him to climb a telephone pole to escape the wrath of the angry support gunner. The next couple of weeks consisted of a steady regiment of PT training and squad tactics as we worked up to be ready for deployment when it all kicked off. We were really getting it together, to my surprise. Royce can really think on his feet and has a knack for improvisation. Lang can stay cool and deliver clear remarks into the radio even under the stress of explosions, enemy fire, and Harris and Lee cursing at each other at the top of their lungs. Mills can take the helmet of a mannequin target at 100 meters with nothing but an iron-sighted SA-80, and Lee can send a stream of lead flying into an area as small or as large as you like. Of course, me and Harris haven't gotten rusty at all. I perforated the turret or every scrap tank on the AT weapons range, and Harris has kept all our weapons and equipment tip-top shape, as well as rigging us up a homemade FM radio so we can listen in on the top 40 countdown the Yanks got to listen to on the other side of the base. On the last day of training, before orders came down to us, something truly shocking happened. It was during a live-fire exercise in the kill house, a maze filled with targets laid out like the interior of a building to simulate CQB scenarios. We had breached the front door of the building and cleared the first room together. 4 hostile targets down, and were clearing one after the other down a long straight hallway. Now, to emphasize how important the speed is at which you engage a target, some of the targets had been rigged up with paintball guns. They would activate and fire back at you via remote control if the officers in charge of the training session felt like you weren't quick enough on the draw. We cleared the first 3 out of the 5 rooms in the hallway without a problem. However, Harris and Lee felt it was a fine time to start their daily squabbles as we were getting ready to breach room number 4. Harris: "Just stay behind me, darling. Daddy's got this handled." Lee: "Why don't you go fuck yourself, pretty boy, and let the men take care of his?" Roy snapped around furious. "You two knock it the fuck off," he said in the most aggressive whisper you could imagine. The two went quiet again, but the gauntlet had been thrown down on who was the better soldier in close quarters combat. So far, Harris had eliminated 3 targets to Lee's 1. Royce kicked in the door and charged in. The proper way to enter the room is to funnel single file and as quickly as possible to cover your sector of the room. Well, Lee and Harris were not, trying to get any bit ahead of the other, so they came in at the exact same time, and 3 stooges themselves into the doorframe, causing both of them to stumble through the door and miss their sectors that me and Lang had to cover as well as our own. A voice echoed on the intercom. "Arrow Squad, you fumbled that breach and failed to follow proper range safety. One more mistake like that and I will inform your commander." Harris and Lee shot curses at each other under their breath as we regrouped and got ready for the final breach in this hall. Same procedure as last time. Harris and Lee were to be the 3rd and 4th men through the door behind me and Royce. "Breaching, breaching, breaching!" I kicked in the door and went in, dropping 2 static targets and 1 paintball target before I could get a shot off. Royce knocked out 2 on the left, and Lee laid down a fusillade to take out the last 3 in the right corner. Lang, Mills, and Harris had no targets in their sectors. Roy, Lang, Mills, and I had filed back out of the room when it happened. "Now that's how it's done," smirked Lee at Harris. Harris let his inner prick out for a moment. "Yeah, is that what you told your last squad before they got shut up?" Without a word, Lee suddenly charged Harris after he had turned to leave the room and shoved him to the ground so hard. He slid at least 10 feet across the concrete floor. Harris rolled over as soon as he realized what happened and saw Lee towering over him. Just as he was about to leap back to his feet and go after Lee, 3 splashes of orange mist erupted from Lee's left shoulder, side, and hip. Harris paused and turned his head to see, hidden in the shadows of a closet, was a paintball target. "Don't just lay there! Fucking shoot it, you daft!" Lee yelled, as Harris rolled onto his right side and double-tapped the target. We all ran back in to find the scene as the intercom echoed again. Arrow Squad, you cleared the building, but suffered a KIA. You failed this exercise, but because of the circumstances I've observed, I'm not recommending any disciplinary actions. I'm sorry, Harris said, looking at the floor as he was getting to his feet. Lee grumbled as he left to go change out of his now stained uniform. I fucked up now, didn't I, Dex? He asked as he dusted himself off. No more than usual. You two are gonna have to knock this shit off though, or we're gonna end up cleaning toilets for the next 6 months and never do our actual jobs again. You think he likes Twinkies? What the fuck are you talking about, Jimmy? A peace offering. I'll fix his bet and give him the last box of Twinkies I've lifted off that news crew when they were interviewing the commander. That plan is ridiculous, but so are you, Jimmy. Too right, mate. Too right. It turns out Lee did like Twinkies and actually laughed at one of Harris's jokes while sitting on his now secure and freshly made cot. These parts are especially hard for me to recount. As you can see, we were bonded as a team and friends. It was an extremely hot Monday morning when we got the call to be ready for deployment within 24 hours. We thought the whole force was about to deploy and the liberation of Q8 was about to begin. We spent all morning prepping and organizing our gear, as well as getting into the necessary headspace for real combat. There's always a possibility that one, a few, or all of us wouldn't make it back, but we were ready to do our damnedest to prevent that. At about 1400 hours, we were called to meet with our commander for our first real mission brief. A lieutenant fresh out of training picked us up in a Land Rover and drove us across the base to an airplane hangar that was used at this time as a warehouse for equipment and weapons. We were ushered by the lieutenant through the building to a room near the rear where 2 officers were waiting to give us our briefing and outline what our mission and duties will be here in country. We had been selected to join the force to hunt down and destroy the chemical weapons Saddam had used on the Kurds back in '88 and was rumored to be preparing to use on the coalition forces in the event of an invasion of Kuwait. We took our seats, and the officer standing in the shadow of a projector stepped forward in front of us. A tall, thin man with great hair and a thick, well-manicured mustache. Gentlemen, my name is Colonel Starkey. You have been gathered here based on your exceptional skill sets to carry out a task of the utmost importance. The first slide, please, Captain. The colonel nodded to the young officer standing behind the projector. In that moment, the projector screen transitioned from a blank white screen to a satellite image of a well-fortified bunker standing alone in the barren desert. This is the target of your mission. Satellite imaging located this bunker in the southern deserts of Iraq, approximately 20 miles from the Kuwaiti border. Next slide, please. The projector then switched to a photo taken from the same angle, but after dark, showing trucks being unloaded into the large blast doors of the bunker. We have significant intelligence leading us to believe these crates being unloaded are in fact chemical munitions, transported here for quick deployment in the event of the coalition invasion. The next slide, please, Captain Welsh. The screen switched to a profile picture of an Iraqi officer. This is General Amir Soleiman of the Iraqi Republican Guard. He had been known to be a key figure in the Iraqi chemical weapons program since the beginning. We also have good reason to believe he is on site at this facility currently. So now you know the facts. On to the plan, gentlemen. The final slide, please. The officer brought up the final slide, showing again a bird's eye view of the bunker and the surroundings, but now from a much wider angle, showing the desert and some ancient ruins that surround the bunker. Colonel Starkey then drew a collapsible rod from his pocket and extended it before beginning to trace it along the slide. You'll be inserted here, approximately 3 kilometers south of the bunker via helicopter. From there, you'll proceed on foot to the target. Once reaching the target, you are authorized to make your way inside by any means necessary. Once there, you are to locate and destroy any chemical munitions you find, and conventional munitions as well if you find it convenient. You are also to locate and eliminate General Soleiman with extreme prejudice. Finally, you are to gather any intelligence you can find, especially if it is found on or near General Soleiman. Once your mission is completed, you may radio command back here at HQ using the code word Archangel. A chopper will return to the location of your insertion and pick you back up. The colonel took the rod and began to collapse it again in his hands. Now, any questions? Royce raised his hand and chimed in. Sir, what is the contingency plan in case the chemical weapons or the general aren't on site? The colonel smirked and replied, Then you are to eliminate all Republican guard on site and destroy any valuable materials and equipment. Any intelligence you find is also to be secured and extracted with you at all cost. Royce shook his head in the affirmative. Yes, sir. After Royce finished, I had a question of my own. Sir, I raised my hand. What weapons and equipment are we authorized for this operation? The colonel nodded. Right. You and your team are authorized to gather any weapons and equipment you deem necessary from the armory in this hangar. Be advised though, this operation is just one of many being carried out at the moment, so it's first come first serve. Yes sir, I replied. Now hop to it men, our timetable is as limited as my own. We all got up and filed out of the armory. When we got there, we were somewhat underwhelmed by our selection. Thankfully, there was plenty of CRBN equipment and the related first aid for chemical weapon exposure. However, for weapons, we had a much more limited selection. The SAS had evidently gotten here before us because all the non-standard weapons like M16s and MP5s had been taken, along with all the suppressors, leaving only the standard SA-80s and an L-86 LSW, which Lee snatched up along with a considerable amount of ammunition. We all grabbed a Browning high power and holster off the rack as well. I, being the designated grenadier, grabbed as many rifle grenades as I could carry and stuffed them in my pack. The C4 used for demolition was split up between the team in case someone got hit. We each got one charge apiece to blow the chemical weapons and anything else that would need a quick and thorough removal. We got completely suited up and filed out of the barracks towards the waiting helicopter, the rotor splash stirring up a torrent of sand all around the landing pad, causing us to squint. We lifted off right at sunset, heading towards the border. As I sat in the open door, staring out at the dark orange setting sun casting shadows over the sea of sand, I started to get an eerie feeling. Not just the pre-mission jitters to be expected though. It was more like the feeling of dread you get as a kid when you're forced to walk down a dark hallway to get to the light switch at the other end. That there's something out there in the desert tonight, more dangerous than chemical weapons or elite Republican Guard. I put those thoughts to the back of my mind though, for the sake of my mates. About an hour later, we had reached the LZ under the cover of darkness. The chopper sat down and let us off. We left the helicopter and fanned out in all directions to secure the LZ and make sure there were no scouting parties that could give away our presence. LZ clear, I said over the radio, letting the pilot know he's good to lift back off. Alright boys, let's get moving, Roy said, taking the lead. We then headed out, following the compass directions given to us back at base. We walked single file, each of us covering a section of the landscape, scanning the horizon for threats. This is already getting old, Harris quipped about 15 minutes into the trek. Better get used to it. This desert is our sandbox for the next year, I shot back. You getting the feeling we're strolling into the lion's teeth? Harris asked, more seriously. Honestly, yeah. But we're Marine Commandos. That's what we do, Jimmy. I cracked a smile at him to lighten the mood. Too right, mate. He chuckled back. That dreadful feeling hit me again as I watched the Commando Sea King helicopter disappear again over the horizon, accompanied by the feeling of being watched, not like by enemy scouts or snipers, by something primal, supernatural. They say some people can sense when a spirit or ghost is in the room with them. Well, I never personally believed that, but that's the only way I could describe that particular feeling. We walked for about 45 minutes over a terrain of ridges and sand dunes until we reached the outside perimeter of the bunker. We knew we were close by the small piles of rubble and half-collapsed walls of the ancient village that once stood there. We zigzagged around the ruins as we walked, and I started to notice there were a lot of writings on the walls that weren't in modern Arabic, probably from close to the time that these buildings were first built. The ink they used was a deep red, like scarlet, but aged for a dozen centuries. I passed close to one of the particularly tall walls, still standing, and as I did, the writing on the wall had a faint coppery smell. Surely not, I thought to myself. But then again, it wasn't uncommon for people to use animal blood as a form of spiritual protection back in those days. The Book of Exodus, for example. If it were blood though, it would have to be hundreds of years old at least. There's no way it would still be this intact, let alone still have that distinctive metallic odor. After we had passed the outer ring of ruins, we came up to the bottom of a ridge that, according to the satellite photos, was the last crest before the bunker compound itself came into view. Royce threw up his fist to signal us to hold up. Then he opened his hand and dropped it to his side, holding his hand flat, letting us know to go prone and begin crawling up the ridge. The sand shifted under us with every move, making the crawl even longer and more strenuous. When we finally reached the top of the ridge a few minutes later, Royce was the first to peek his head over. When he signaled it was safe, we all moved into position to see over the top. I pulled out my binoculars, as did the rest of the squad, and we went to work formulating our plan of attack. The compound was in what you would call the village center of the ruins. 2 of the buildings were mostly still intact. The layout was as follows. There was a single dirt road bisecting the compound and leading the bunker at the rear of the outpost. There was a guard shack to the far front of the base and to the right-hand side of the road. Next to it stood a checkpoint-style wooden gate that blocked the road until the guard in the shack moved it by hand. To the left side of the road, close to the middle of the outpost, stood a 2-story adobe structure that the compound's radio and antenna stuck out of. The other building still in use was a single-story, 1-room hut that was being used as an ammo storage building. It stood to the left and rear of the radio tower and was the closest structure to our position. There were a few tents and canopies set up closer to the bunker on the right side of the road. Presumably, the guards slept, ate, and worked out of these. Directly across from the tents sat 2 empty lorries and UAZ-469, the Soviet version of a jeep. Scanning the perimeter, I discovered the 2 biggest threats to us. Number 1, the front guard shack had 2 sets of cables running out of it, one to the huge blast doors of the bunker, and the other to a metal pole with 4 large loudspeakers at the top. The guard in that shack could simultaneously shut our only path into the bunker and alert the entire facility at the same time. Number 2, the Soviet T-55 main battle tank parked between a canopy to its left and a large stack of ammo crates on its right, about 10 meters from the cluster of tents mentioned above. Thankfully, the tank's crew were all outside the tank performing maintenance when we arrived. The last of the base's defenses consisted of 8 roaming guards packing AKs and hand grenades, and a guard tower with a single soldier armed with a PKM machine gun and a pair of binoculars. Overall, counting the 4 crewmen of the tank and the sentry in the guardhouse, we had 14 hostiles to deal with. Royce keyed his radio and started quietly forming a strategy with us.
Alright lads, we need to be quick and precise with this one. Mills, I want you to side in on the sentry in the shack. You'll kick us off by dropping him. Yes sir.
Mills responded.
Sir, wouldn't an unsuppressed shot alert the guards inside the bunker too?
I interjected.
Those blast doors are hermetically sealed to prevent chemical or bioweapons from escaping. That should make them fairly soundproof.
The sergeant replied.
Now back to it. Lang, I know you're pretty good too, so you'll be responsible for taking out the man in the tower before he dials us in. Copy, Sergeant,
said Lang.
Lee, I want you to start with the patrol nearest our position and work your way back till nothing is left standing. Sir, yes sir.
Lee replied while unfolding the bipod of his L-86 and moving into a comfortable firing position.
Dexter, Harris, you'll be moving forward together. Harris, you'll be clearing the ammo storage and the radio building. Dexter will be covering your 6 and taking out the crew of the tank when things get loud.
Me and Harris shot a look and grin at each other, acknowledging our unmatched luck in squad operations.
Alright, are we all on the same page? Good, let's get going. Wait, Sergeant, I've got vehicles inbound from the north.
Mills calmly cut in. We all turned to see the headlights of 4 vehicles headed down the 1-lane dirt road to the compound. We all dug in and got as low as possible, while still having eyes on the compound below. As the vehicle came close to the front gate, we could identify the convoy consisting of 2 lorries in the front half, followed by a black sedan with Iraqi flags on the hood, and 1 last lorry bringing up the rear. As the convoy pulled in and came to a stop a few yards from the blast doors of the bunker, the vehicle doors started flying open. The lead and rear lorries were full of more Republican guards who filed out of the back and lined up neatly on either side of the blast doors. The second truck in line held scientists in lab coats, carrying various sizes of suitcases and crates of other equipment, presumably for chemical weapons inside. The front passenger door of the sedan then swung open. A sharply dressed officer stepped and then hurried to the back door of the sedan, opening it while giving a salute. Out stepped the big fish, General Solomon. But he wasn't alone. A hunched-over, balding man dressed like a college professor in a brown suit with a white shirt and plaid tie stepped out behind him. He followed the general as they walked towards the bunker. The blast doors opened as the general approached, and the men standing at attention on either side saluted as the general and the professor walked down the staircase into the facility. The scientists filed in behind them, followed by the 20+ soldiers standing guard, and the drivers after they parked their vehicles in the same flat area as the lorries and the UAZ. The blast doors then shut behind them, and the guards resumed their normal patrols.
Can we move now, sir?
Harris asked.
Go for it, Harris, but stay quiet.
Royce ordered in the same quiet yet aggressive tone as the day Lee and Harris had to quarrel in the kill house. Harris and I crawled over the top of the ridge. We almost lost our footing and took an unfortunate tumble on the steep inner wall of the dune. Once at the bottom, we crouch-walked into the perimeter of the outpost. We timed our advance with them when the guard in the tower had his back to us. Our closest target was the ammo cache. Harris and I stacked up on either side of the door. Harris then slowly turned the knob to open the door. Slowly but surely, he pushed the door open while keeping his rifle to his shoulder with his free hand. He entered the dark room, and I stood rear guard watching his six. Creeping slowly in, it was evident most of the ammo had been redistributed to troops closer to the front line. Thankfully for us, most of the crates were empty. No guards hiding in here as well. Harris pulled out one of the blocks of C4 and cut it in half with his combat knife. He then attached his spare detonator and placed it at the bottom of a box of RPG rockets. If things get loud, they're gonna get real loud, he whispered to me. After creeping back out of the building, we checked our surroundings and advanced to the next target. The radio building was about 15 meters to the front of the ammo cache. We waited for the guard in the tower to turn away again, and we sprinted to the shadows on the back side of the building. We're going to have to split up for this one, I whispered to Harris. You'll have to clear the radio room solo while I keep eyes on the tank crew. When this kicks off, I cannot let them get buttoned up in that thing. Harris: No problem, mate. I got this. Just like the kill house, right? He winked at me, and I rolled my eyes in return. Just stay focused and be careful, Jimmy. Harris used the noise from the radio's diesel generator to cover his entry into the building. I crept along the left side of the building and peeked in the window about halfway down the wall. It was the only window in the radio room. I got there just in time to see Harris tiptoeing in. The room was again empty, besides the chair and desk that the radio's receiver sat on. I turned away and continued my slow walk to just behind the front left corner of the building. I could see the tank and its crew on the other side of the road. I then dropped to one knee and got ready to take them out. That's when things went sideways. As I peered through the SUSAT sight on my S880, lining up the tank crew for a quick dismissal, I felt the presence of someone or something behind me. I spun around, rifle still to my shoulder to see. Nothing in front of me. But atop the sand dune, just about 3 meters to the right of my other squad mates, stood a thin black figure. He was looking at me, and not them. So instead of immediately engaging it, I started to key my mic and warn them. But in the blink between my left hand leaving my rifle and hitting the push-to-talk on my radio, it disappeared. As I stood there wondering if I was losing it, a very real threat made itself known. Harris was gathering the logs and codebooks from the desk and let his situational awareness lapse. Out of the shadows of the doorway crept an Iraqi soldier. He drew his pistol and pointed it directly to the back of Harris's head. I had no choice but to fire a single shot, right through the Republican guardsman's forehead. This, of course, threw the entire order of operations off for the attack. I heard Mills' shot come no more than a second after mine. Turning back around to cover my assignment, I got confirmation Mills did not miss. No guard in sight in the shack, and a red stain painting the opposite window. Not a half a second later, I heard a second crack, followed by the thud of guard in the tower hitting the earth 20 feet down. Lang did his job. Back on target now, the tank crew realized what was happening and started scurrying up the side of the tank. I pulled the trigger twice on the bloke with one leg in the commander's hatch first. He threw his arms up and rolled back out of the hatch and off the tank. Next was the driver. He was grabbing his hatch to close it when I relieved him of some gray matter. The two others were fighting over the loader's hatch. I tapped the trigger 5 times to make sure they were both done. Now that my job was done, the sort of tunnel I had in that moment subsided and the fusillade of noise that surrounded me became clear and deafening. Lee was heavy on the trigger on that LSW, loosely following the rule of firing in bursts long enough to say the words, "Die motherfucker die," to yourself. He had cut down 2 guards already, and I witnessed the third collapse as a dozen rounds of 5.56 ripped through his lower torso and thighs. That left 5 guards still in the fight. Coming around the front of the building, Harris had moved up and kicked open the front door beside me. He came out firing on full auto like a Cockney Rambo. He had nothing of significance, of course. That's when 2 guards charged around the side of a tent to our front. We engaged swiftly, and both guards hit the ground at almost precisely the same time. One of the remaining guards made a dash to the guard shack, while the 2 others covered, presumably to trigger the alarm. The 2 guards covering a sprint were in defilade from our position behind a large stack of ammo crates. They had dialed in the squad's position on the ridge as well, suppressing it. That's when Harris made a dash across the outpost towards the bunker to draw their fire. Him and his damn heroics. The guards, seeing an easier target, started firing at Harris, kicking up dust right behind his boot heels, right before Harris would have tried to run through those blast doors. Royce and Lang sighted in on the 2 guards and riddled them from the top of the ridge. At that same moment, I turned and drew a bead on the guard as he was attempting to close the guard shack door behind him. I squeezed the trigger about a dozen times and watched the wooden door shudder as it splintered. At least a few of my rounds connected. Given there were no sirens or clacks of locking black doors, I ran over to the guard shack and slung the door open to confirm my suspicions. Seeing someone up close that you just killed is a different kind of terror. In that moment, you're the monster in your own horror movie. But this was war, and he could and would have gotten us all killed. Now that the short but fearsome firefight was over, the rest of the squad filed off the top of the ridge as we all regrouped in the center of the outpost. Well, we sorted that out, but who fired that first shot without permission? Royce asked, slightly irritated. I did, sir, I said, stepping forward. Royce. Corporal, that move could have destroyed this operation. Sir, he saved my life. Harris interrupted. What? Roy said. Harris. I lost focus gathering intel and a hostile got the drop on me. If not for Corporal Dexter, I'd have a new hole in my head. Royce. That was a critical failure on your part, Lance Corporal. But that was an impressive response by Corporal Dexter. I'll forgo recommending a reprimand for you, Harris. However, I expect to see you in the kill house and running PT every day until our next deployment. Is that clear? Sir, yes, sir, Harris said. Royce. Now then, Harris, Lang, get to figuring out those blast door controls. Mills, Lee, get in the guard tower and watch our perimeter. Dexter, you're with me. We'll be the first 2 through those doors when they open. Yes, sir. The squad and I responded as we received our orders. We split up and ran to our positions. Royce and I took up positions on either side of the road, about 5 meters apart, with interlocking fields of fire on the doors. Lee and Mills hurried up the ladder to the tower. Lee set up his L-86's bipod near the front left corner of the tower. Mills rested the forend of his SA-80 on the near right corner. Lang and Harris stepped over the 2 guards in the shack, stepped up the door controls on the desk, and pulled out their Arabic to English phrases translation books. A few seconds later, Harris grabbed the lever on the control panel and yanked it down 2 positions. The doors then slowly started to open. Royce and I kept the doors covered until they completely opened. Then we ran up to the huge threshold and sighted in on the staircase leading into the bunker. "Clear," I said. Royce, "Clear." The white staircase heading down to a concrete wall with a single door was empty. Beyond that door would be the true entrance into the facility. Royce and I held our positions as we waited for the rest of the squad to form back up around us. As Lang and Harris made their way back to the group, Lang asked, "You translated it that fast?" Harris grinned and turned to him. "Not really. I just noticed that particular phrase was color-coded green. Green means go, right, mate?" "Jesus Christ, mate." Lang giggled as they made their way back to the group. We all took up positions at the edge of the staircase to watch the door for about a minute and a half, just to make sure no curious Republican guardsmen came out to see who was at the door. Royce, "Alright, before we go any further, let's suit up in the NBC gear." We then pulled off our backpacks, pulled out our NBC smocks, gloves, and gas masks. We removed our helmets, web gear, and boots, and pulled the smocks over our standard uniforms, then sealed up the suits, slid on the gloves, and refitted all our kit. We looked like we were about to restart the Battle of the Somme in all this kit. We then made our way slowly down the stairs and stacked up around the door. Royce, "We breach on 3. 1, 2, 3. Breaching, breaching, breaching." I grabbed the door and swung it open. Royce and Mills were first through the door, followed by Lee, Harris, Lang, and myself. I was surprised by the lack of gunshots as I took my turn through the door. I took my position on the far right to notice that the first room was empty, a good-sized lobby-like area with a large circle desk in the center, presumably where the Republican Guard receptionist would sit. There were doors on each of the other 3 walls to our front. Above each door was a stainless steel sign with Arabic lettering. Time to get the translations books back out. This time, it was my turn to play telephone with the signs. We were looking for anything pointing to chemical weapons, so I turned to the C section of the book, found the word chemical, and started trying to match the lettering on the signs to the one in the book. The door on the left wall was a pretty close match, so we decided to give it a shot. We stacked up again, breached again, and yet again, no resistance. The other side of the door opened up to a straight concrete hallway, with a few doors and windows on each side. At the very end of the hallway stood a large vault-like door. I'd bet money that's where the weapons were stored. We made our way down the hall, peeking the windows and covering the side doors as we went. The smaller rooms were research labs, empty and lights out. They hadn't been used in at least a few days. The cages along the back wall where animals were presumably held as test subjects were empty as well. Thank God. The second to last door on the left didn't have any windows though, so we breached it. The room was the storage area for the artillery shells that would be charged with chemical weapons when it was time to deploy them. "Well, can't let these slip away," Royce said as he armed his C4 charge for remote detonation and tossed it into the center of the room. We pulled back out of the room and resumed our sweep. We reached the large door in the back. It was sealed by a large lever placed in the area where a traditional doorknob would be. No key to lock or combination lock though. Frighteningly lax security for a chemical weapons storage room. Royce, "Dexter, get the door." I grabbed the lever and turned it counterclockwise from the 12 to the 9 o'clock position. The locks audibly receded, and I pulled the door open. Thank God this room was deserted too, as I shudder at the idea of firing a rifle in here. The room held 4 large metallic cylinders sitting horizontally, resembling giant welding tanks. Bingo. Target number 1, I thought to myself. "Alright, get to planting that C4, boys," Roy said, grinning for the first time tonight. We spread out and started planting our charges. As I passed close to the tank Harris was rigging up, I noticed something peculiar. The pressure gauge on the right end of the tank was reading 0. "Wait a sec, Harris. Don't waste your charge on this one. It looks empty." I turned towards the other guys. "Hey, check the pressure gauge on your tank before planting your charge." Lang, "Mine's reading 0. Lee, "So is mine." Mills, 0 here too. The tanks were empty. The hell? Were we too late? These were some of the thoughts we vocalized as we looked at Royce. "Royce, looks like they moved the weapons. Fuck." Okay, we can still finish this. Set charges on the ceiling here, and along the hallway headed back to the lobby. If we can't destroy the weapons, we'll destroy their means to store them. Yes, sir. The squad and I responded, as we got to work rigging this entire wing. We had to step jump off of squad mates' hands like cheerleaders to reach the ceiling and plant the C4. That gave us some much needed levity. We entered back into the lobby area and found it empty again. Where the hell is everybody? Royce. Okay, let's get Solomon. Dexter, find out which of these doors leads to the staff quarters. I reopened my book and flipped to the S section. Sure enough, the lettering on the right side door matched up. At this point, we had all but assumed we'd find no one in this area either. Suspicion confirmed. Another long empty hallway with doors on either side. We did search all the offices anyway and came up with some valuable documents, maps, and manuals. The last office down the straight hall was Solomon's. We kicked it open, hoping to find him writing his memoirs or some bullshit. But no luck. His office was rather strange though. It was adorned with lots of old paintings and relics. I'm talking about BC era stuff. Framed tablets, scrolls, ancient weapons. This guy was a real aficionado of antiquity. The thing that really unsettled me though was the ancient drawing that hung framed behind his desk. It depicted a circle of stick figure people surrounding a little altar. Floating above the altar was another stick figure. This one much more detailed, and just felt out of proportion. In relation to the others, its limbs were much longer and ended in visible fingers. They had colored the figure's eyes with purple dye, and the top of its head had small nubs protruding out. The painting looked to be the oldest in the room by aesthetics, but also in the best shape. The whole squad was feeling my eeriness at this point. Mills. This guy is seriously unbalanced. Harris. Too right, mate. Royce. Well, we're going to get him back in balance with a few ounces of lead. Let's move out. We headed back down the hallway and back into the lobby. Only one door to go. We stacked up and got ready to breach when something hit me like a train. A high-pitched scream echoed through my head and let out an audible gasp. What, Corporal? Royce spun around and looked at me. Did you not hear that? I asked, perplexed. Hear what, son? He asked genuinely. It was nothing, I guess. Probably just air ducts acting up. I tried to make sense to myself. I know this has been a slog, but I need you to keep it together for the rest of the squad, Dex. Roy said, laying a hand on my shoulder. Yes, sir. Won't happen again. I responded as I readied myself to breach. We kicked in the door and flooded into the next room. This one was very different. It was a metal catwalk surrounded by a cylinder of canvas material. The far end of the walkway ended in a T with a sealed door. The right of the door was a staircase that led down to a second landing with another door in the same position. We walked to the other end and made the decision that we should definitely take the high ground. We would make entry through the top door. I volunteered to be the first through the door while Royce held it open for the rest of us. 1, 2, 3. Breaching, breaching, breaching. I was through the door and immediately blinded by some bright lights. After a few moments of dreadful uncertainty, my vision came back. The other side of the door opened up into a massive archaeological dig site. The tall spotlights they used to illuminate the area made it clear the entire dig site was located inside the walls of some huge ancient building. The 20-foot adobe walls were full of cracks that trickles of sand slowly slid through. The vaulted ceiling had ornate chandeliers still hanging centuries later. The cobblestone floor was lined with pews on either side of a carpeted walkway that led up to a small altar. This was a temple. That's when I noticed the man standing at the altar. I quickly took cover behind the railing of the catwalk, followed closely by the rest of the squad. Royce was the last one in and scooted himself in next to me. We peered over the edge of the railing, watching the spectacle beneath us. There were 10 of Solomon's men standing along the outside edge of the altar, facing away from us in the pews. A few meters in front of them stood the scientists. They were now wearing scarlet red robes with gold threading and ornate designs across the back and arms. Handcuffed and on their knees sat the other 10 of Solomon's men. They were arranged in a circle around the center of the altar. The fuck? I heard the squeaky clamor of one of the old doors inside the temple open. To the left and right below our position, out walked Solomon and the professor. Solomon was still in uniform, but the professor was now wearing a purple robe in the same style as the other scientists. Under his left arm, he carried a large black book with gold engravings. We froze, praying that he wouldn't look up as they made their way over to the walkway and down the carpeted aisle. Stepping up to the altar, the professor pulled the hood of his robe over his head. The rest of the scientists turned, bowed, pulled the hoods of their robes over their heads, and then walked over to form a circle directly behind the restrained men. Oh no. The professor opened the book and then began loudly reciting stanzas in some ancient dead language. After each one, the rest of the scientists recited it back in unison. After 4 or 5 of these repetitions, the scientists drew long ceremonial daggers from their robes and put them against the soldiers' necks. After one final recitation, they dragged their knives slowly across the soldiers' throats. The blood spewed from their necks, colliding in mid-air and dropping straight down to the circular divot in the center of the altar. The divot was filled with sand that turned a deep red as it filled with the sacrificial liquid. After the bodies had been mostly drained, the scientists let the poor soldiers' bodies fall backward, and the remaining guards dragged them away. As soon as they were moved, the scientists took their place and dropped to their knees, raised their hands to the sky, and began chanting loudly again. I was about to vomit. What the fuck have we found? How long has this been going on? Those poor men. They looked to be the youngest of the group from the trucks. My mind was racing as fast as my heart. Then the horror really began. The crimson sand turned black as coal and started to shake as if a tremor was confined to under the small divot. What the fuck? The liquid then began to ascend from the divot, carrying the black sand with it. No way. No. It can't be. My mind, and likely the minds of the rest of the squad, were pulled back to the drawing in Solomon's office. It was real. It was all real. The shape twisted and formed into the horrid caricature illuminated in the drawing. Pitch black skin, long spindly limbs, long clawed fingers. The emaciated figure, the purple eyes, the small blunt horns, they all came to life before our eyes. I couldn't take my eyes away from the horror, but if I did, I know the rest of the squad was as horrified and speechless as me, shaking and on the verge of vomiting. The scientists continued to sing loud praises to the entity. The professor, the sick fuck, walked up and dropped to his knees in front of the entity, reaching out like he wanted to touch the hands of a messiah. The entity reached out one hand and said a short sentence in the same language the scientists were using. Its voice was deafening and echoed off the walls of the temple. At that moment, sand started pouring in from the cracks in the walls and ceiling. It gravitated to the altar, around the creature, blowing in an impossible wind like a tiny sandstorm around the entity. This can't be real. I could hear Mills mutter to himself. This is the only time I've ever heard his voice raise above a cool monotone, and it was shaking in terror. Royce was stunned, standing perfectly still, mouth agape. Lee kept sighted in on the beast with his L-86. I could see his arms trembling slightly, and beads of sweat running down his cheek. Lang was on the verge of tears, breathing rapidly and letting out short whimpers. Harris just looked at me, waiting for me to come up with a plan. The entity then rested its hand on the professor's bald head, laughing maniacally like an echo out of hell itself. The professor began laughing, enraptured by it. Then, the beast gripped the top of the professor's head. His laughs turned to pained shrieks. But before he could actually scream, the beast rotated his head 90 degrees and twisted it off like a soda cap. The professor's blood showered the beast. It extended its long black tongue to catch the red mist. Then raising the severed head into the air, it drank the blood that flowed down from its severed neck. The other scientists then began to chant in a panic, obviously begging for mercy. That's when the beast's other hand raised. It pulled sand up from the ground and formed it into jagged spikes in mid-air. And with a flick of his wrists, the spike flew through the faces of all 10 scientists. That's when Soliman drew his gun and commanded his men to fire. Soliman got 3 shots off before the beast formed a scimitar-like blade in its hand and bisected the general at the waist. Some of the guards broke and ran, while others let loose on full auto, spraying the beast with 7.62mm bullets. The beast absorbed the rounds just like a sandbag, cackling again as it went one by one, cleaving the terrified soldiers. This was truly hell come to earth. The soldiers attempting to escape found the bottom door locked from the other side. They begged, screamed, and tried to push, charge, and shoot the door open, but to no avail. The beast was now hovering off the edge of the altar and moving towards our position. That's when I finally found the will to speak. I turned to Royce. "Sir, your orders?" Royce still sat motionless. "Sir, your orders?" Royce just shook his head in disbelief. "God damn it, Sergeant, what do we do?" I screamed as loud as I could. Royce's lips finally started to move. Weapons free, weapons free, weapons free." Royce flipped his SA-80 to full auto and held down the trigger. I and the rest of the squad joined a second later, laying down a withering volume of fire directly into the entity. The entity was unhurt by the storm of fire, but was knocked off balance by the sheer force of the wall of lead impacting its front, annoying it. It turned its attention from the remaining Republican guard up to us. On the catwalk, it raised its arms as if it were commanding the sandstorm like an orchestra and threw them out towards us, followed by a tidal wave of sand that pummeled us. Everyone except for Lee took cover, the sand shredding away our NBC gear, burning any flesh it contacted. Lee stayed triggered down on his L-86, emptying mag after mag into the demon, having his protected gear slowly dissolved off of him. Lee was lucky that the 3 remaining Republican guards beneath us took the opening given by the demon focusing on us to charge it, firing at its waist, attempting to knock it over. The entity immediately realized their plan and channeled the sandstorm downward onto them. The poor souls just disappearing from head down to toe, like a sandblaster brought down on rusted metal. At that moment, I reached out and grabbed Lee, yanking him down behind cover. "Get the fuck down! I'm not letting you get yourself killed!" I screamed in his ear. At that same moment, Harris took the opening, pulling the pin on a frag grenade and tossing it at the entity. The entity pulled his arms back into his chest. The sandstorm around it suddenly retracted and formed a dense, dome-like shield around it. The grenade collided with the dome and bounced off, exploding impotently on the floor a meter or so in front of it. "Jesus Christ, it's unkillable," I heard Harris mutter to himself, pale in the face. Fall back, Royce commanded. I stood first and grabbed the door handle, throwing it open. One by one, the squad broke contact and ran through the open door. Lang, then Harris, then Mills, and then Royce. Lee got back to his feet and continued firing on the demon, not retreating even though we were all screaming at the top of our lungs at him. As the entity started to rise higher in the air, coming eye level to us, Royce and I had enough. We both grabbed Lee by the shoulders and dragged him through the door. Harris and Lang slammed it close and pushed the massive locks back into place. "God damn it, Lee, we're not doing this again," Royce screamed in rage in Lee's face. Lee still stayed silent, breathing heavily but steadily, his eyes holding a 1,000-yard stare on the door that separated us from hell on earth. Royce gave up on getting a response from him and turned to Lang. "Lang, get on the radio and get us an evac chopper and some close air support." "Yes, sir," Lang shouted before taking a knee and pulling the handset from the PRC-77 radio he carried. Arrow to base. This is Arrow 10. We need immediate evac and close air. How copy? Over." No response. He repeated. Arrow to base. This is Arrow 10. We need immediate evac and close air. How copy? Over." Still nothing but static. Arrow to base. We are in danger of being overrun. Please respond." "God damn it!" Lang hissed. "Sir, I'm getting nothing but static. This thing must be causing some kind of interference. We'll have to try again outside." "Wait a minute. We can't just let that thing get outside." Harris cut in. If it can do all that with just the sand leaking through the cracks in the walls, what could it do with the whole Arabian desert? Royce shot back. So what do you suggest, Lance Corporal? In case you hadn't noticed, bullets and grenades don't do shit against it. Sir, all we need to do is... Before Harris could finish, a large gash appeared in the door behind us. A huge black, short hand had thrust through it. The sand of the blade then spread out across the front of the door, pulling it off the hinges like a corkscrew uncorking a wine bottle. The entity floated in mid-air just on the other side. A traumatizing grin spread across its face. Fire! Fire! Royce yelled. The whole squad opened up on it again, the bullets still phasing through it without even an annoyance. The entity then rose one hand, forming a dagger-like shard in mid-air that aimed directly at Royce. But before the shard could accelerate, a single round from Mills's rifle ripped through it, scattering the sand it formed from back to the floor. Nice shot, Mills, Harris yelled. It's my fucking job, Mills replied. The entity then began to form more shards, one after the other. Mills was thankfully able to keep up and knock one after the other from the air. The fight continued for several more seconds that felt like hours, shards and bullets flying in all directions like a whirlwind from hell. That's when Mills's rifle jammed, a horrifying event that would unfortunately become common among users of the SA-80 rifles we were issued. That's when the entity took the opportunity and formed a wall's worth of those razor-like shards. At the same time, it started to form a dome of sand to shield it from any counter-attacks. The only thing I could think of doing was dropping to one knee, pulling my backpack off, and fishing out one of the anti-tank rifle grenades I brought. I quickly slid the rocket-like projectile over the barrel of my SA-80, sighted in, and fired. The grenade made it just past the dome shield before the demon could fully form it. We saw a flash of light and a deafening thud behind the shield. The sandstorm then dropped to the floor as the entity was seen flying backwards. A football-sized hole was made in its right shoulder. It slid across the ground and came to a rest against the back wall, its right arm dangling below the massive hole. I looked down to see the large chunks of glass on the catwalk. That's it. It's the heat. Sand can't handle extreme heat and pressure without turning to glass, I shouted, almost gleefully to the squad. At that moment, the sand started to rise again from the floor, and the wound I just tore in the demon began to fill back in with sand. Oh, come on, Harris shouted. Fall back, Royce yelled as we headed towards the back door to the lobby area of the bunker. We shut the door behind us and locked it again. So do we just keep repeating this till we run out of doors? Harris asked. No, Lee chimed in. I'll bait it into the chemical weapons room. When it's in there with me, blow the charges. Fuck you, Lee. I'm not leaving you. Harris shot back. It's not your call, lad, he said solemnly. It's the same for me, Lee. We all go home, or nobody goes home, Royce added. Lee, sir, there's no way we're going to stop that thing from getting out of here if we don't bury it down here. Royce, maybe so, but I'm not going to let you kill yourself over it. Lee, why not? I'm trying to make sure the rest of you make it out of here. Royce, because I made a promise to your families to bring you all home. God damn it, I will not lose another squad, Lee screamed, his eyes tearing up and his voice cracking. I should have died in the Falklands, not those boys. Why did God decide I needed to live with the guilt of watching them die? They had wives, children back home. I don't even have a goddamn pet waiting on me. Royce calmed and responded. Lee, I'm so sorry for what happened, but dying will not change the facts of the past. You're right, Lee said, looking down at the floor. Royce stepped up and laid a hand on his shoulder. But I can change what happens next. Lee let rip with a savage uppercut that knocked Royce cold. What the fuck, Lee? We yelled collectively. Sorry, Sarge, but I know what I have to do, Lee said, pulling the C4 detonator off of Royce. Lads, grab Royce and get him out of here, and close those blast doors behind you. Do I make myself clear? This what you really want? Harris asked. Yes, pretty boy, this is what I want. Lee cracked a small smile towards him. When you get back home, just make sure you tell the ladies at the pub the first round is on Royal Marine Albert Thaddeus Lee, okay? Harris smiled. Tears streamed down his face. Sir, yes sir, he saluted. I was in shock along with Lang and Mills, but Lee wouldn't accept any other arguments. We all stood at attention, saluted, and I grabbed Royce and threw him over my shoulder before heading to the door. I pulled my remaining max out of my web gear and handed them off to Lee. "Make 'em count, old boy." I smiled. We ran through the door to the stairs and clambered up to the blast doors. Lang and Mills covered the door while I laid Royce down again on the ground. Harris was sprinting to the guard shack to close the blast doors. That's when we heard the door holding the beast back break down, followed by the intense rat-a-tat of Lee's L-86. You could hear the sound change as he led the beast into the hallway where the C4 lay planted. The blast doors then started closing. Harris had found the switch. Lang broke contact and got back on the radio. "Arrow to base, arrow to base. This is Arrow 10. We need immediate evac and close air. How copy, over?"
Copy that, Arrow 10. Dispatching choppers to the evac point.
We had finally gotten through to HQ. We all cheered and breathed a sigh of relief. Then our hearts collectively fell into our stomachs as we felt the tremor of the C4 detonating inside the tunnel. Lee was gone. We took a moment of mourning as we waited for the helicopters. That moment was interrupted, however, by that numbing scream I heard before in the bunker. Except, we all heard it this time. We all dropped to our knees, holding our ears in pain. Through the pain, I still managed to notice the sand started to kick up around the dunes that surrounded the outpost, slowly rising into the air and circling the perimeter of the outpost. Jesus Christ, not again, I thought, completely exhausted at this point. This was a nightmare that just wouldn't end. The sand became thicker and thicker and spun faster and faster around the outpost, trapping us into our own personal sandstorm. Seconds later, the night sky had completely disappeared. That's when the low-pitched whine of the entity pushing on the other side of the blast doors started. "Jesus Christ, what do we do now?" Lang yelled, all his hope drained from him. Harris, Mills, and I looked around erratically, trying to form any sort of plan to save our certainly doomed hides. "I've got it," Harris yelled as he took off in a dead sprint. As we followed his lead, we soon realized what he had in mind. He was headed for the T-55 tank parked on the left side of the outpost. "Let's hope the keys are in it," Harris yelled. I don't know how he still had his sense of humor at this point. Harris mounted the front of the tank and hopped in the driver's seat and started it up. "Dex, Mills, you're loader and gunner. Lang, stay with Royce and keep your ear to the radio for when the chopper gets close." We didn't acknowledge the orders verbally, but instead went right to work. Royce was finally coming to now. Lang helped him to his feet and guided him to get behind the large stack of crates for cover. I could tell the exact moment Lang gave Royce the news of what happened to Lee. He put his fist through one of the empty crates and raised his head to the sky. His screams were drowned out from me by the sound of the tank engine. I took the loader position and got to work scanning the ammo racks in the tank. 100mm high explosive fragmentation. If this won't stop him, we're gonna need a nuke, I thought to myself as I loaded the massive shell into the breech. At this point, the seams of the massive blast doors started to part, the hydraulic pistons that held it closed straining under the unearthly force pushing on them. Harris threw the tank in gear, and we got ourselves lined up with the entrance to the bunker. At that same time, Lang's radio started to chatter again.
"Arrow 10, this is Stork 310, your extraction force. We can't see your position in this storm. Please signal your current position. Our engines can't handle much more of this."
During our fixation on fighting this entity, the storm it conjured up now covered miles of the surrounding desert, a preview of what's to come if we didn't stop it. Lang and Royce took off towards the tank to warn us that we could soon lose our only way out of here. After hopping up on the turret of the tank, Lang stuck his head in the hatch to warn us. "The chopper is getting close, but he can't see us in the storm. We need a way to signal him, fast." My mind raced as I searched for an answer. That's when it hit me. "Grab Harris. Ask him for the detonator for the C4 in the ammo dump. That explosion will light up the sky no matter how bad the storm is," I yelled, struggling to drown out the noise of the tank and the storm. "Copy that," Lang responded as he hopped down to the driver's hatch and took the detonator from Harris. "It's almost through the doors," Mills yelled his right eye pressed to the side of the tank's main gun. Through the sight, he could see the wretched face of the demon slowly come into view through the expanding gap in the doors. It was about to escape. Or so it thought. "Jesus Christ, Mills! Fire already!" I yelled, witnessing the horror slowly freeing itself from its steel and concrete cage. "Almost. Almost. Swallow this, you shitty imp!" Mills growled as he squeezed the trigger. The deafening blast of the 100mm gun rocked the tank backwards, the huge ball of fire blinding anyone watching for a millisecond. The heavy shell whistled through the air as it hurled to its target. The demon's reflexes weren't so fast after all, we found. Mills had waited just long enough to ensure the shell could just pass through the gap in the door, delivering its full force and payload directly into the entity. The subsequent blast and cloud of smoke shot out of the gap in the door, and the demon disappeared from view. A moment after, Lang detonated the explosives in the ammo dump from behind the safety of the tank. The explosion shook the tank and the fireball from it reached high into the night sky.
Arrow 10, this is Stork 3-1. We see you. Landing 50 meters to your north.
The radio crackled to life. "We did it!" Lang yelled in triumph as he hugged Royce. "Let's get the fuck out of here, boys," Roy said, slightly grinning. Mills, Harris, and I climbed out of the tank together. "You glassed that bastard, Mills." Harris smiled. "For Lee," Mills simply responded. Harris and I nodded solemnly and responded. "For Lee." The storm had finally started to die down as our extraction force came in to land. A Commando Sea King helicopter flanked by 2 Lynx Mk7 attack helicopters. The Sea King landed first, the side door sliding open to reveal Colonel Starkey inside. He stepped out and waved us towards his position. We filed into the chopper and took our seats, sitting opposite the Colonel and his 2 bodyguards. As the helicopter lifted off, we got to watch the 2 Lynx choppers fire 2 tow missiles apiece into the front and roof of the bunker, collapsing the entrance completely. "Where is Lee?" was the first question the Colonel asked. He didn't make it, sir. He gave his life to save us," Royce responded, staring down at his boots. "That's a damn shame. Lee was a fine Marine." The Colonel frowned. "Colonel, there's a lot you should know about what happened down there." "There was something else going on down there?" The Colonel interrupted. Yes, sir. But how did you?" Royce tried to respond. "You knew? You fucking knew?" Harris screamed. "You sent us into that slaughterhouse knowing full well what was waiting down there? Lee is dead because of you." Harris lunged from his seat towards the Colonel. Luckily, Royce and I caught his collar and pulled him back to his seat. At that same moment, the Colonel's bodyguards drew their sidearms and aimed them directly at Harris's forehead. "One more outburst like that, and I'll have you shot, Lance Corporal. Do I make myself clear?" The Colonel growled. Harris just grumbled in response as we held him in his seat, his stare slicing through the Colonel like a razor. "Now, if you'll allow me to explain," the Colonel said in a calmer tone. "Yes, we knew Suleiman was heavily into the occult and esoteric. Yes, we knew the chemical weapons facility here was likely a cover. Yes, we knew this site is situated in the center of the ruins of a Bronze Age city that disappeared mysteriously before the birth of Christ. And yes, we knew the city once worshipped a minor deity said to have control over the sands of Arabia. Make no mistake, lads, what you did tonight was worth far more than destroying containers of sarin gas. You saw firsthand the power of entities like the one you vanquished. But why send us? Why not just batter the outpost with cruise missiles into oblivion?" Royce shot back. "It's a tale as old as King Arthur. It takes warriors to slay monsters." The Colonel grinned. "We left a warrior buried underneath the rubble back there, you son of a bitch." Harris growled. "No battle is without casualties, son. Lee will be awarded the Victorian Cross for his sacrifice. Now shut your mouth before you spend the rest of your days in a cell." The Colonel hissed. "Jamie, not another word. You won't do Lee's memory any good from a cell or in a pine box," I whispered to Harris. He sat in silence for the rest of the flight back to base. The Colonel asked numerous questions about what we encountered on the way. all of which were answered by Royce in the most professional manner he could muster. We all went back to our barracks and sat mostly in silence for the rest of the night, collectively mourning our fallen comrade and friend. We were also dealing with the concept that monsters were in fact real. All the things our parents told us about, not fearing what's in the dark, they were all lies, whether they knew it or not. As you'd expect, none of us slept that night. The next day, we got orders that we were being rotated out for a new unit and would return home for good, completing our tour of duty. Just like we arrived, Harris and I were seated together on the C-130, taking us back home to England. We talked about Lee a lot on the way home, and how we'd make sure to honor his memory and get some sort of justice for how we were deceived. And this is it. My tell-all on what really happened the night of January 14th, 1991, in the deserts of northern Iraq. This is Corporal Dexter, signing off. For now.